Hello, and welcome to the April edition of Third Thursday at Hoover's. And it's great to see so many returning visitors again tonight. So I'm Jerry Flegel, President and CEO of the Hoover Presidential Foundation. And we're so glad that you could be here with us this evening. You know, I would really like to encourage you to regularly check our website and Facebook page, as well as those of the library, historic site, and your favorite public library for special program offerings that will pop up in the months ahead. In fact, we have online programs every month for you to enjoy, including some special programs that we have sprinkled in between, hosted by members of the Hoover family. We will also be adding some more on later on for May and June as well. Next month, one of our Herbert Hoover National Historic Site park rangers will present Iowa's Communal Utopias, and he'll describe life in the Amana colonies, the Icarian communities, the Clydesdale colony, and other sites in Iowa. Peter is the ranger that is going to be presenting on that, and he does great research, and you will really find his presentation very interesting. And of course, registration is free, and it's open on our website now. And that program will be on May 20th at 6 p.m. As for this program, we'll invite you to enter questions at any time during the program throughout the Q&A feature you'll find along the edge of your screen. You may also vote for questions someone else has entered if you'd like to hear those answered as well. As we may not have time to answer all the questions provided, top vote getters will get asked first. Today's presentation is called Shaping a Presidential Image, the Curious Case of Herbert Hoover. We're very fortunate tonight to have Dr. George Nash presenting, as he has spent many days and hours in the Hoover archives studying the life of Herbert Hoover, and he is the author of very thorough multi-volume biographies of Herbert Hoover, besides many other books on that. In fact, I like to characterize George's knowledge of Herbert Hoover in that he has forgotten way, way more than I have ever acquired on there. Dr. Nash has been a regular contributor at the Hoover campus events, and you may remember him just recently as part of our special January virtual program with Margaret Hoover. George, it's always a pleasure to welcome you to these programs, and we're glad to hear tonight's presentation. Welcome.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for that very gracious introduction, and good evening, everyone. I'm coming to you from outside of Iowa tonight, although, as Jerry just mentioned, I have spent some of my life in Iowa very happily at the Hoover Presidential Library. I'm in what I sometimes call East Branch, my home here in South Hadley, Massachusetts. So it's a pleasure to be in the company of so many Iowans, and I suspect some non-Iowans as part of this program this evening. As Jerry just mentioned, my lecture is entitled Shaping a Presidential Image, the Curious Case of Herbert Hoover. On March 4th, 1929, Herbert Hoover was sitting on top of the world. As he took his oath of office that day to be President of the United States, he could look back on a career path that had curved unbrokenly upward. Born in Iowa in 1874 and orphaned before he was 10, by 1914, Hoover was an internationally acclaimed mining engineer living in London. By the aftermath of World War I, he was an international humanitarian hero who had pioneered vast war-related relief endeavors unprecedented in human history. Millions of Europeans owed their lives to his exertions. By 1920, he was also an American hero whom many wanted to put in the White House. A son of Quaker parents living in the Middle West a decade after the Civil War, Hoover had grown up in a Republican village where the only Democrat, as he remembered it, was the town drunk. Identifying himself in 1910 with the progressive wing of the Republican Party, he contributed financially to Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose campaign in 1912. Early in 1920, in response to pleas that he run either as a Democratic or Republican candidate for president, Hoover first labeled himself an independent progressive, alienated from Republican reactionaries and Democratic radicals alike. Many Democrats, including Franklin Roosevelt, urged him to run for president as a Democrat. Roosevelt secretly hoped to be his running mate. He might well have obtained the Democratic nomination if he had tried. Eventually, though, Hoover declared a Republican affiliation and allowed his Republican supporters to campaign for him. His pre-convention efforts met with little success, but he greatly impressed the eventual nominee, Warren Harding, who called him the smartest gink I know. In 1921, Harding appointed him to his cabinet. As Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, Hoover quickly became one of the 3 or 4 most influential persons in the US government. In the context of the 1920s, Hoover was an unabashed governmental activist. As Secretary of Commerce, he took the initiative in promoting national waterway development, radio regulation, regulation of the infant aviation industry, stabilization of the coal and railroad industries, wildlife conservation, abolition of the 12-hour day in the steel industry, and elimination of waste in industry. He seemed ubiquitous. It was said of him that he was Secretary of Commerce and Undersecretary of all the other departments. Driving Hoover's activism was a well-developed political philosophy, which he explained in 1922 in a little book titled American Individualism. By this term, he did not mean old-fashioned laissez-faire, a concept he repudiated, but rather a social philosophy grounded in what he considered to be America's most precious social ideal, the ideal of equality of opportunity. As a self-styled progressive, Hoover accepted some governmental regulation of private enterprise to protect and foster equality of opportunity. But he emphatically rejected old world statism and such notions as government operation of business. He seemed to be seeking a middle way between political extremes. As he put it in 1920, I do not believe that this country is either reactionary or radical. I believe that the better way, or rather I believe that the country at heart is progressively liberal. I believe that the better way to secure needed reforms in political, social, and economic conditions is through the progressive element in the Republican Party. By 1928, Hoover's reputation was immense. Nominated by his party for president over the opposition of the GOP's conservative old guard, Hoover was elected in a landslide and without ever having held an elective public office. It was a remarkable feat. It was during Hoover's 1928 campaign that his image as president, or to be precise, his image as prospective president, began to take shape. Much of the campaign oratory on his behalf was conventional. He was hailed as a son of pioneers in the American heartland, a rural boy who had become a man of the world, a poor boy and orphan who had overcome obstacles and climbed the ladder of success. In short, an embodiment of the American dream. But what was more remarkable was the variety of superlatives that were used to describe Hoover. He was acclaimed as a great engineer and peerless executive, and as America's greatest administrator in human welfare. He was lauded as a master of emergencies, who had not only saved millions of lives in Europe, but had also recently organized a tremendous relief effort for 600,000 Americans rendered homeless by the Mississippi River flood of 1927, the worst natural disaster in American history. As Hoover campaigned for the presidency in 1928, some of his supporters produced and circulated a 40-minute silent film about him with the title, Herbert Hoover, Master of Emergencies. You can watch it on YouTube today. Hoover was increasingly acclaimed that year also as a great humanitarian, most notably by John McNabb, the San Francisco attorney who used this epithet in his nominating speech for Hoover at the Republican National Convention. After that, numerous Republican partisans repeated McNabb's accolade. In September, 37 prominent American women declared in a full-page endorsement of Hoover in a women's magazine that he was the great humanitarian of the age. Some Republicans went further, proclaiming their party and its presidential nominee to be the architects and guardians of the nation's prosperity. In one widely circulated full-page newspaper advertisement titled "A Chicken for Every Pot," it appeared in the New York Times and elsewhere, a group of Republican businessmen asserted that Republican prosperity in the 1920s had raised living standards, reduced working hours, silenced discontent, and put the proverbial chicken in every pot and in every car in every backyard to boot. The advertisement closed with the ringing words, "Wages, dividends, progress, and prosperity say, vote for Hoover." Such arguments and rhetoric were broadly persuasive in 1928, when prosperity reigned throughout most of the country. But there were two features of Hoover's developing image that caused concern in some circles. First, was he too much of an outsider? Already well known in official Washington for his acute sensitivity to political criticism, did he possess the skills and temperament to deal successfully with his political peers, some of whom in his own party disliked him? His Democratic opponent, Governor Al Smith of New York, was known as the happy warrior. Hoover never exuded that kind of zest. As much as possible, he avoided photographers. He disliked crowds and dreaded speaking before them. He regarded political campaigning as a chore. As Richard Nixon once said of himself, Hoover, one might say, was an introvert in an extrovert's profession. Second, from the time Hoover entered public life in World War I, there was always something enigmatic about him. Reserved, laconic, protective of his personal privacy, with an aura about him of impersonal efficiency, he was not an easy person to understand. Although he was greatly admired for his achievements, many contemporaries were puzzled by him. Who's Hoover? Was the title of a book written about him in 1928. Is Hoover human? Asked a noted magazine article of that title shortly before the election. To counteract this undercurrent of unease, his campaign managers tried hard to humanize him through campaign biographies and other methods. One of their favorite devices was a widely disseminated photograph that perhaps some of you have seen of a smiling Hoover posing with his pet dog. On November 6, 1928, Hoover was overwhelmingly elected to the highest office in the nation. Outwardly, he seemed confident. And yet, curiously enough, a few weeks before he assumed the presidency, he experienced a shiver of doubt. Down in Miami, Florida, where he was vacationing before his inauguration, he made a startling confession to a friend. He said, "I am not at all apprehensive of the normal work of the presidency. It is arduous and taxing, of course, but that is to be expected. What does somewhat disquiet me is the way in which I have been over-advertised. My friends have made the American people think me a sort of Superman, able to cope successfully with the most difficult and complicated problems. They expect the impossible of me, and should there arise in the land conditions with which the political machinery is unable to cope, I will be the one to suffer. It was as if he had experienced a premonition of the ordeal that would shortly befall him. On March 4th, 1929, Hoover took his presidential oath of office. Writing some months later about his inauguration, the journalist Anne O'Hare McCormick described the nation's state of mind on that day. She wrote, "We were in a mood for magic. Mr. Hoover was inaugurated, and the whole country was a vast, expectant gallery, its eyes focused on Washington. We had summoned a great engineer to solve our problems for us. Now we sat back comfortably and confidently to watch the problems being solved. The modern technical mind was for the first time at the head of a government. Almost with the air of giving genius its chance, we waited for the performance to begin." Initially, Hoover did not disappoint. He called Congress into a special session to enact relief legislation for agriculture, which had not been enjoying the same level of prosperity as the rest of the nation. He established a federal commission to study the nation's justice system, and especially the problem of prohibition. He invited Congress to make limited changes in the government's tariff schedules, and he initiated plans for a host of other reform projects. And when the stock market crashed just 7 months into his term in October 1929, Hoover took steps that changed the course of American history. Instead of allowing the business downturn to run its course, he intervened on a scale unmatched by any previous president. Convinced that the country's difficulties were psychological, he dominated the public stage with a flourish of presidential activism. He convened a series of conferences at the White House with business leaders who listened to his appeals and pledged, in defiance of classical economic theory, to maintain wage scales at their current level. That is, not to lower wages as the recession set in. He likewise conferred with labor leaders who promised not to strike or seek destabilizing wage increases during the emergency. To counter an expected uptick in unemployment, he promised that the federal government would augment its public work expenditures in a big way. His program for recovery won widespread public support. Both then and forever after, Hoover was proud of the extraordinary agreements he had forged, proud of his break with the austere fatalism of laissez-faire. Confidently, deliberately, and self-consciously, he had abandoned the principle of political non-interference with the business cycle. As never before, the President of the United States had placed one man, himself, in charge of guiding the nation back to prosperity. And having done so, he was quick to proclaim success. On March 7th, 1930, he told a news conference that all of the evidences indicate that the worst effects of the crash upon employment will have been passed during the next 60 days. Less than 2 months later, he said, "I am convinced we have now passed the worst, and with continued unity of effort, we shall rapidly recover." He declared that what he called his great economic experiment had, in his words, succeeded to a remarkable degree. Hoover's optimistic prophecies of early 1930 eventually cost him dearly in public disillusionment. But at this juncture, they did not appear so outlandish. Many other seasoned observers, including distinguished economists, shared his belief that the worst was, or very soon, would be over. And many gave him credit for calming the public mood after the crash. For a time, it appeared that the Hoover method of cooperative action outside of government, with industry and labor and so on, had been vindicated. In the early months of 1930, the stock market recovered much of the ground it had lost during the previous autumn. But then, as would happen repeatedly in the next 3 years, just when Hoover thought he had restored economic equilibrium, unexpected turbulence arose. In June 1930, after months of recrimination, Congress enacted and Hoover reluctantly approved the highly protectionist Smoot-Hawley tariff. Just how destructive that tariff proved to be remains a subject of debate, actually, among economists and historians. But psychologically, its impending enactment appeared to upset the edifice of confidence that Hoover was building. As the congressional struggle over the tariff reached a climax, the stock market tumbled. By mid-June, when the new tariff took effect, the market had wiped out virtually all of its gains of the past 7 months. Then, in the summer of 1930, across much of the Midwest and South, the worst drought yet recorded in American history ravaged the crops of 30 states. Millions of acres of planted fields were ruined. Farm income in the devastated region fell by 25%. No one could blame Hoover for the drought. But as 1930 wore on, a number of influential commentators became critical of his performance as president. Time and again, they accused him of timidity and vacillation in his dealings with Congress. Hoover, said the pundit Walter Lippmann, suffered from a peculiar weakness. He had not yet mastered the political art. It is easy to see why politicians in both parties distrusted him. He was simply not one of their kind. His dislike of political rituals, his workaholic seriousness, and his reliance on non-political experts set him apart from what he privately derided as the beer garden on Capitol Hill. That was during the time, of course, of Prohibition. He was also difficult to pin down ideologically. His unusual blend of progressivism and anti-statism pleased neither the left nor the right. For his part, Hoover believed, as he told an audience shortly after the crash, that the most dangerous animal in America is the man with an emotion and a desire to pass a new law. Congress, he added pointedly, cannot inspire or lead voluntary forces. Privately, he was more pungent. He labeled one senator the only verified case of a negative IQ. When in 1930, one of Hoover's granddaughters was born, his first response was, "I am glad she doesn't have to be confirmed by the Senate." In a whimsical mood one day, he remarked, "There ought to be a law allowing the president to hang 2 men a year and without being required to give any reason." As the political headwinds against him gathered force, the president gave little sign of reconsidering his governing style and message. Then, in November 1930, the Democrats made sweeping gains in the congressional elections. And in the next House of Representatives, they actually held the majority. Until this point, Hoover had largely controlled the headlines with his anti-depression initiatives. But as 1930 yielded to 1931 and the Depression persisted, he found himself increasingly outflanked on his left and forced onto the ideological defensive. Early in 1931, for instance, Congress debated how to assist the impoverished farmers in the South who had been ruined by the recent drought. Should the federal government break precedent and provide direct financial assistance, known in that day as the dole, to farmers for human needs? To the consternation of his senatorial critics, the president said no. The American Red Cross, he insisted, which had been distributing food to drought victims for months, was fully capable of handling cases of what he called individual distress. After 2 months of extraordinarily bitter political warfare between the White House and Capitol Hill, the drought relief legislation was enacted in a way which technically averted the dreaded dole. But Hoover's humanitarian reputation had been bruised, and in the next 2 years, he was increasingly accused of being indifferent to human suffering. Just days after the drought relief brouhaha on Capitol Hill ended, and for months thereafter, the embattled president exhorted his fellow Americans to maintain their traditional system of mutual self-help, voluntary giving, and local government responsibility for people in need. Any tapping of the federal treasury, he warned, any federal usurpation of these responsibilities would, he argued, strike at the roots of self-government and lay the foundations for the destruction of our liberties. He admonished Americans to solve their problems outside of government and reject what he called the opiates of public charity. And he strenuously and conscientiously practiced what he preached. In 1930 and 1931, for example, he organized and led great national voluntary fundraising campaigns that raised unprecedented sums for relief. In the second one, nearly $100 million for relief of the unemployed and other victims of distress. Time does not permit me to trace all the steps by which Hoover's heroic presidential image of 1928 and early on was inverted between 1929 and 1933. Suffice it to say that the negative stereotyping of him was not exactly accidental. During his administration, the Democratic Party's masterful chief publicist, Charles Michelson, unleashed an unremitting barrage of press releases and ghostwritten speeches disparaging Hoover's missteps and shortcomings. As the economy worsened, millions of angry Americans looked for scapegoats, and Hoover became a principal target. It was not the Great Depression, it was the Hoover Depression. Shanty towns of the homeless were named Hoovervilles. The insides of trouser pockets were called Hoover handkerchiefs. Newspapers were called Hoover blankets. So if you were lying down on a park bench, you could cover yourself in a so-called Hoover blanket, the newspaper you were reading. Armadillos were called Hoover hogs. Hoover was accused of personally promising a chicken in every pot, something he himself never said. And I'm not sure he had anything in particular to do with that now infamous advertisement of 1928. He was accused of repeatedly promising after the Depression set in that prosperity is just around the corner, another sentence he did not actually utter. During 1932, when the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was established and other federal initiatives were undertaken to combat the Depression, Hoover behaved in a notably activist and decisive manner, quite different from that first year in office. But this did not stop Democratic orators from asserting in the fall that he had pursued a do-nothing policy throughout his term. Thus was further engraved into public consciousness the notion that Hoover was not the enlightened technocrat, practical idealist, and reform-minded humanitarian Republican that he had been portrayed to be in 1928, but rather a stubborn and heartless reactionary. This, the anti-heroic image of President Hoover, prevailed in the public mind for years to come. On March 4th, 1933, Hoover left office a virtual pariah, maligned like no other American in his lifetime. Defeated for re-election by Franklin Roosevelt, he became the subject of highly personalized historiography, in which he was portrayed as either the hero, or far more frequently as the villain, of a great moral drama culminating in the New Deal. Why did this happen? Fundamentally, it was because both Hoover and Roosevelt agreed on this thing. The election of 1932 had been no ordinary contest. For Roosevelt, it had been a call to arms, a crusade for a New Deal and social order in which the forgotten man would finally receive his due. Hoover was equally dramatic. This contest is more than a contest between two men, he declared shortly before the election. It is more than a contest between two parties. It is a contest between two philosophies of government. The election, he warned, in words he later deemed prophetic, would determine the nation's course for over a century to come. In the 1930s and early 1940s, both Hoover and Roosevelt knew that they were engaged in a contest for the American mind and political soul. What had gone wrong since 1929? Was the Great Depression a crisis of capitalism, a product of Hoover's mismanagement, or a catastrophe brought on by uncontrollable happenings abroad? Was the New Deal a humane and pragmatic reform movement, or a muddled and meddlesome experiment in collectivism? Which narrative of these traumatic events would shape our knowledge of that era and thus our own political behavior? The answer to these questions would depend on how we understood the presidencies of Hoover and his successor. For years to come, at election time, Roosevelt and his successors repeatedly ran against Hoover, as the expression had it. It was a sign of how deeply the harsh anti-Hoover image had penetrated into American folklore. For Hoover, who lived 31 and a half years as an ex-president, one of the central themes of those years was his tireless quest for vindication in the eyes of history. During the 1930s, for example, he orchestrated the preparation and publication of several heavily documented and highly sympathetic volumes on his presidency by some of his close associates. Later on, he published memoirs of his own, in which he meticulously defended his record and denounced what in 1944 he called the lie that the Depression of 1930 to 32 was caused by the Republican Party, that the party did nothing about it, that the people were allowed to starve, and that Roosevelt rescued the country from a complete wreck. The whole of the story put over by the New Deal orators, he exclaimed, was the most gigantic dishonesty ever known in American politics. So as you see, the passions persisted. Hoover lived long enough after his presidency to regain the respect of most of the American people and to become a benevolent grandfather figure on the American right. He made little headway, however, with the mostly libertarian or liberal historians like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., whose book, The Crisis of the Old Order, published in 1957, was perhaps the high watermark of pro-New Deal, anti-Hoover historiography. But not long after Hoover died in 1964, the shaping of his presidential image took a dramatic turn. In 1966, the bulk of his papers, comprising literally millions of documents, became available to scholars for the first time at the Hoover Presidential Library in Iowa. It prompted a considerable and on balance upward reappraisal of this man and his achievements. Whereas earlier, generally pro-New Deal historians had tended to emphasize what they considered to be Hoover's failures and flaws, many younger historians poring over his papers discovered a far more accomplished, creative, and intelligent figure than the previous paradigm recognized. In the fresh wave of scholarly writing that flowed from this research, a new Hoover, a complicated, intriguing, and in some ways tragic figure emerged. But not all of the more recent writing on Hoover was conducive to his rehabilitation. When Hoover died in 1964, his political comeback died with him. And within a decade and a half, his image among conservatives radically changed. No longer was he thought of by them as the greatest Republican of his generation, as someone called him. Instead, in a curious and ironic twist in intellectual fashion, just when many left of center professional historians were taking a somewhat more respectful view of Hoover as a forgotten progressive, many on the right, influenced by the rise of supply-side economics and libertarian critiques of the modern welfare state, rejected him for that very reason, that as president, he had been a progressive whose interventionist policies, they believed, paved the way for the even more egregious statism of the New Deal. Hence, in 2021, this year, one rarely hears a good word about Hoover among American conservatives. So where does this leave us tonight? It is my impression that the post-1966 wave of Hoover revisionism has crested. Today, Hoover is better understood, more respected, and increasingly recognized for his humanitarian achievements. But in polls of presidential historians, he continues to rank low. Why? According to one narrative, favored by liberal historians and shaped by Keynesian economics, Hoover fell short as president because he was too anti-statist, too committed to voluntary action, and too devoted to fiscal conservatism and the gold standard. In this interpretation, the Great Depression was a crisis of unregulated capitalism, and Hoover's failing was that he did too little, too late. A competing narrative favored by free market economists and many conservatives argues that the Great Depression was not a failure of capitalism, but a failure of government, whose interventionist policies profoundly exacerbated the nation's economic woes. Among these alleged policy errors, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the massive federal tax increase of 1932 in an attempt to balance the budget, and the high wage policy that Hoover insisted upon in 1929. In this line of interpretation, Hoover's failing was not that he did too little, but that he did too much. And there matters stand today. Nearly 90 years after Hoover left the White House, he remains for many a political orphan, unwelcome in the pantheons of the left and the right alike. Is this the end of the story? Maybe not. Between 1929 and 1933, the supply of money in the United States contracted by 1/3, a staggering, almost unbelievable decline. Why did this happen? In recent decades, a number of economists, led by Milton Friedman, have placed the blame upon the policies, passivity, and ineptitude of the Federal Reserve Board. In the judgment of Friedman, it was the Fed that was mainly responsible for turning a garden variety recession into a major catastrophe. But if this was so, if the Fed was primarily culpable, what should historians now say about Hoover? In all of our history, no president has been more conscientious and hardworking than he. Could it be that his incessant labors to defeat the Depression were not so much right or wrong as irrelevant? It reminds me of the Greek mythological figure Sisyphus, forever condemned to push a heavy boulder up a hill. Every time he nearly reached the top, the rock would roll back down and Sisyphus would have to start over. From 1929 to 1933, Herbert Hoover arguably was our modern Sisyphus. Every time that he seemed to be on the brink of success in taming the Great Depression, some new crisis would erupt, while the silent killer, the contraction of the money supply, would grind on. Each time, like Sisyphus, he would start over, unaware that much of his perpetual motion and Herculean effort may have been doomed to futility by the monetary policies of a government agency beyond his control. So I leave you with this food for thought. Perhaps someday historians will conclude that Hoover's presidency was stymied not so much by his political limitations or his leadership methods, or even by his political philosophy and policies, but by something neither he nor virtually anyone else at the time quite understood: the fatal misjudgments and errors of the Federal Reserve Board. And if that reassessment occurs, it will be time to reshape again the fluctuating presidential image of Herbert Hoover. Thank you.
George, thank you so much. Great talk. And we've got a lot of questions, so I think we've got some time for questions on that. So I'm going to start off with the first one. Was Hoover his own worst enemy? Abraham Lincoln indicated that public opinion is everything, and without it, elected officials cannot succeed. Yet Hoover refused to use speechwriters who were better at producing elegant and memorable phrases. And he also refused George Ackerson's suggestion of weekly radio addresses. And then, of course, later, Ackerson's friend Steve Early pitched the same idea to FDR, and the fireside chats became history. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Hoover did appear quite a bit on national radio during the course of his presidency. So in some ways, he foreshadowed FDR. Hoover was a master of publicity in many ways, but he was not the kind of personality or temperament that exuded what you might call Rooseveltian charm and exuberance and so on. And Hoover recognized this as the nature of himself. He said, "They can't make a Theodore Roosevelt out of me." And there were times when some of his handlers, as we might today call them, would say, well, why doesn't Hoover do something dramatic? And he shied away from that kind of gesturing, which he thought was perhaps pandering to the masses and so on. Late in the election campaign of 1932, some of his friends concocted the idea that Charles Lindbergh, who was supporting him, Lindbergh, the great aviation hero, should barnstorm with Hoover by flying Hoover around the country to rallies. I'm not sure this ever got to Hoover's attention, but I can imagine he would not have looked kindly upon it. So he tended to be stiff. I think possibly he recognized, as I quoted him, in fact, in my talk, as fearing that perhaps his handlers had overdone it and made him out to be a kind of a Superman, a miracle worker, and so forth, although his achievements were certainly estimable, and he certainly was, I think, a highly presentable candidate for president in 1928. But what he did in 1928, he only gave about 7 speeches. And they were all very dignified and lengthy and rather tedious sometimes explanations of political philosophy. These were not rousing orations such as Al Smith was capable of giving. Now, in desperation in 1932, during the campaign, Hoover initially planned not to campaign at all. He just thought, I'll let the people decide. Now, that was his pose, but I don't think his press secretary Jocelyn believed him when he said that Hoover was really just going to step aside, stay in the Oval Office, and let things happen. But once the Maine primary of the state of Maine took place in September and the Republicans took a drubbing in a Republican state, Hoover realized that there was no alternative for him to get out in the hustings. And one reason I think for his concern about doing that a little earlier in the year was frankly the fear of assassination because of the bonus march coming to Washington and the sense of discontent in the country. And yet he overcame that, but it was an ordeal for him. But he really gave some fighting, combative speeches. Perhaps it was a little late for him to do that, but he even got called the Fighting Quaker by the New York Times in an editorial after he gave one of his speeches. I think it was in Indianapolis. But then he went to New York, and I quoted that speech in New York where he said, this is going to shape the nation's destiny for the next century. A very prophetic speech. And if you read it carefully, a very thoughtful speech. And Hoover himself wrote that arduously. But it was an hour long. And there are 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden, and they're wanting, give it to him, Hoover, and so forth, as he had done a couple times in other cities. But instead, he gave this almost State of the Union type speech, and it was probably a disappointment because it wasn't rallying people. And Hoover did not like crowds. And he said in a passage in his book, American Individualism, that the mob, the crowd, he didn't say the mob, the crowd cannot think, it can only feel. And he, I think, recoiled from that. And much of his whole approach as president was to take the high road, to explain, to give the facts and so forth, to be a communicator in that way. And I think that was admired, and it was successful in 1928 when the tide was running with him in the economy. But people, I think, were groping for something more. And I know, as a biographer of him, that he felt it inside. There are many, many anecdotes that I could give of his sensitivity to suffering, of his concern for children and the like. But it was not something that he either could easily exude publicly or felt was less than demagogic to do. And so Hoover often said, more or less, that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He didn't say it in those words, but Roosevelt coined the term, and he said it with, I think, Roosevelt's contribution to the country, which was this kind of psychological, let's go get it, let's go get them, let's do it. And so on, Hoover was urging that, but he wasn't embodying it in his methods, in his whole being. And that was a sad thing. And yet, if you go back and read his speeches, many people have conceded then and later that these were really masterful speeches. He might have done better, but with a speechwriter, one would think that was a difference between him and Roosevelt. And I'll stop this answer with this point. Roosevelt had speechwriters galore. They were working on it all the time. And what Roosevelt would do would take it at the last minute and edit it here and there and so on, and then go off and get it as if it was all sort of springing from his brow. Hoover was the opposite. He wrote it all out, and then he let some of his intimate friends serve as editors or give him feedback, and then he'd go out and laboriously work on it again and again. A much more tiring use of energy than Roosevelt's method. But Hoover did not think that it was authentic to do otherwise. And he didn't care for speechwriters, although he was willing to be the ghostwriter of some other people's speechwriters. One of his little tactics in 32 was to write out speeches that his surrogates could give for him, and things that he might have felt a little uncomfortable saying directly himself. So I hope that gives you some better understanding of what Hoover's limitations were in that context, and yet why he behaved as he did. He felt it would be undignified and just unnatural for him to stoop to gimmicks to try to get himself made more popular.
Oh, very interesting, very interesting. Well, Bruce writes, why didn't Hoover adopt the approach to the Depression that the Harding administration took towards the Depression of 1921?
Well, in 1921, there was a severe recession. And what Hoover did actually as Secretary of Commerce was not to leave it alone, but to set up a conference, a White House conference on unemployment, which Harding went along with. And then Hoover proceeded to organize the community leaders all throughout the country to try to find ways of coordinating employment where jobs were vacant and so forth, and put on a kind of a great drive at the community level to restore the economy. And when the economy came back, Hoover thought that he had achieved some of that success. So he was then in the vanguard of what was called in the 1920s the new economics, which argued that you don't leave business cycles alone, that is laissez-faire, and that is something we have moved beyond. We have more knowledge. We have a better understanding of maybe of counter-cyclical economics. And one of the great proposals to emerge from Hoover's experience in 21 was the idea that the government should step in during a downturn and pump money into the system through construction, counter-cyclical spending. And if you look at what Hoover's administration spent on great construction programs, it went up enormously. And some conservatives today say, aha, he was a big spender. But that was part of his philosophy, and he had considerable support in the economics profession for a more activist stance. So if you look at what he did in 29, it was actually very similar in some ways to what he did in 21, except that he wasn't president in 1921. He was Secretary of Commerce, but he learned what he thought were applicable lessons. And so Hoover, one has to remember also, was by instinct and profession an engineer. And engineers just do not sit idly on their front porch and wait for better days to come. Hoover's whole impulse, and that showed as Secretary of Commerce, was to be an activist, but an activist within limits. He didn't want the government to go in and start running businesses. He didn't want socialism. He was really trying to energize the private sector to organize itself, with the government providing kind of statistical help and so forth, information. And government as information provider, not government as a wielder of the whip or something like that. So I think that Hoover, perhaps some historians will argue about this, whether he was mistaken in the lessons that he drew, but there was a great deal of study of the economy that came out of what Hoover did in 21 in response to that recession. And he thought that those lessons, which gave him the lesson the government should do certain things, should not stand idly by, that guided his approach in 29. So I think that would, I hope, answer Bruce's question.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, Kendrick writes, it seems to me that Hoover's depression fighting policies were correct up to a point, but he thought that they were inadequate to fight a complete collapse of the economy. For that, it was necessary to mobilize the full resources of the federal government, which Hoover was unwilling to do for ideological reasons. What do you think about that idea, George?
Well, two things. One, as the Federal Reserve Board continued to mismanage, and that's something that is debated now, but there is a school of thought, as I indicated, that believes that the Fed made things much worse. Hoover was fighting a worsening situation, so the the people didn't understand that I think monetary theory as thoroughly as they might or do today. And so the pressure on him was to go and have government spending and greater government intervention. I think that in 1931, late 31, Hoover crossed the Rubicon somewhat reluctantly, but in a dramatic way. Quickly, to give just a little historical backdrop to this, the British government went off the gold standard in September of 31. And this caused a ripple effect throughout the industrial world. And without going into all the details and reasons why, it led to a tremendous banking crisis in the United States. Something like, I think, 1,200 banks collapsed in the United States a month after the British went off the gold standard. Why? Because people thought the United States would be next, so people were rushing to withdraw their gold from the banks before the banks went under, something like that. So Hoover wanted a private corporation to be set up of banks that would have a fund that would assist their brother banks in trouble and get them to stabilize so that the public would have confidence in the banks and therefore confidence in consuming and producing and so forth. And that was started, but the big bankers were not enthusiastic. They did very little. And so Hoover had to pledge, in effect, that if that failed, he would go to the Congress. And he did. And we got, in February of 32, what was called a government corporation, a bank really of a kind, called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. That was interventionism on a level never before seen in American history. And Hoover was driven to do that because it seemed that he had no alternative. And meanwhile, the Fed wasn't doing anything much to stimulate the economy. It went through a bit of a spurt in the spring of 32, and things actually started to pick up in the spring and summer. And then the Fed said enough of that, and perhaps on the dawn of victory, they sat down to rest, and resting died, to quote an old poem. So Hoover did take many steps that by historical precedent were beyond what would have been in his comfort zone. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation gave out over 4,000 loans in a few months to something like 5,000 banks and other entities. And it was over, I think, over $1 billion, which was enormous in those days when the entire federal budget that year was about $4 billion. So Hoover did a great deal of what you might call interventionism. And he was also maneuvered in some ways into coming to allow federal aid money to be put to give a loan to the states for relief. That was done in the summer of 32, but it didn't have that much impact immediately, but it was, I think, a major turning point on the road to the New Deal. So Hoover, I think, was driven that way, but he always said thus far and no further. He did not want, and he had rules and so forth. So he had a vision that we must have still a voluntary system, a private enterprise economy, guided and regulated, and perhaps in an emergency, assisted by the federal government. But he didn't want to make that the basis for all the economy going forward. So I think that Hoover would, and so he gets criticized, perhaps your questioner is one of them, for not going farther faster. But then the conservatives come along and say, look, the Fed was the underlying culprit here, and Hoover took us farther and faster than he should have, and that he had a kind of an urge to do that anyway because of his nature as a professional engineer. So again, you get back to that debate, which still lingers. Did he do too much? Did he do too little? Or, as I am suggesting, did much of what he did get undercut without anyone quite knowing it by the massive errors of the Federal Reserve Board?
Okay, well, very good. Well, we've got time just for a couple more questions. John writes, could Dr. Nash discuss President Hoover's contribution to American conservatism?
Yes, well, that will be hard to do in 2 minutes, but I'll give it a try.
I think you wrote a whole book on it.
Now, in very, very broad terms, Hoover thought of himself, as I indicated, as a progressive, and then as a progressive Republican, to the left of Coolidge, you might say, but certainly to the right of FDR. And when Hoover left office, after a year or so of silence, he wrote a book called The Challenge to Liberty, which I hope your questioner will look up, published in 1934, in which Hoover identified himself with what he called historic liberalism. And he came to realize that the New Deal was commanding the use of the term. monopolizing the term. So in 1937, he said something which I can almost quote verbatim. He says, the New Deal having corrupted the term liberalism to mean concentration of power and corruption and so forth, he said, it may now be that historic liberalism is conservatism in contrast. And I think that that was the moment when he admitted or said that he was now, in a sense, a conservative. And for the next 30 years almost, he fought the New Deal and engaged in what he called, and this is his term, a crusade against collectivism. And his memoir of that, incidentally, was never published until just a few years ago, and it's called, what is it called here? The Crusade Years. Okay, this one section of it was the Crusade Against Collectivism. I wanted to give it the precise title. And in case you're wondering what I'm doing, the book's on my bookshelf behind me. So he then became a kind of grandfather figure as probably the leading Republican and probably the most intelligent Republican critic of the New Deal. So even though he had a kind of reformist progressive background, he was in a position of fighting what he saw as a lurch to the left on the part of this kind of collectivist muddling New Deal. So Hoover becomes a father figure or grandfather figure, patron saint almost, of the Republican right. And he helped William F. Buckley a little when Buckley founded National Review, for example, in 1955. And Hoover addressed the Republican convention every 4 years and was given a tremendous welcome and so forth. And there are a lot of other examples I could give. So Hoover, I think, did a lot to confine the New Deal. He didn't repel it from the field, but because of that immense energy that he devoted into this crusade against collectivism and critiquing the New Deal for what he saw as collectivist tendencies. Because of that, he helped rally the opposition. And in that sense, I think, and there are other ways I could explain, but time does not permit, he then became a kind of leader of this fight against the New Deal, even though he would be thought of himself as a kind of historic liberal, but he recognized, and maybe your questioner would recognize, that classical liberalism, a term that we use today, is usually a term to identify a segment of the spectrum of American conservatism. And that's, I think, probably primarily where you would put Hoover, looking at his post-presidential period.
Okay, well, this is going to be, got the last question here on this, and this is very apropos considering I call it a hot issue today. Is a part of the Republican campaign of 1928 was some pretty nasty racism. What do you think were Hoover's racial views, and what did he do about it during and after the 1928 campaign?
Well, there was certainly an attempt by the Republicans to break the Solid South. I don't think that that can be reduced to racism. There were several factors that broke several southern states from the Democratic camp where they had been since the Civil War. One of them was the fact that Al Smith, the Democratic candidate, was a Catholic. And for many people in the so-called Bible Belt, that was a very uncomfortable thing. Secondly, Al Smith was opposed to prohibition on liquor. And that was still popular, particularly in the South. So there too, Al Smith was, and unlike Hoover, was unpopular. So much of the reason that the solid South broke and Florida and Texas and several other states went for Hoover was not because he was trying to whip up the white vote. Only the whites could vote anyway, sadly, tragically. But because of these other factors, cultural, political, and so forth. Now, Hoover hoped to reform the Republican Party on the basis of its inroads in 1928. Because it had broken through the Solid South, he made a considerable effort, and a professor, Donald Lizio, has written an entire book on Hoover, blacks, and lily whites. So if your questioner is unfamiliar, he might examine Professor Lizio's very thorough and well-documented treatment showing the dilemmas and so forth that Hoover faced. Hoover wanted to, in the Republican Party South, there were two factions. There were the lily whites who portrayed themselves as reformers, and there were the black and tans. And these two minuscule factions in the Republican Party of the South would compete for the prizes of postmasterships and little crumbs that they might get. There was no chance that they were going to have bigger rewards and so forth. Hoover thought that this was a kind of a rotten system, and he wanted to clean that up. But the part of the problem here was that the faction that presented itself as their cleaner reform faction also thought that reform meant driving the blacks out of what little they had already. So Hoover was constantly maneuvering in a very tough situation. Also in 1927, I should point out that he led the relief effort for the Deep South. And he came under criticism from some blacks because they said that you're leading it at the top and it looks good at the top, but on the grassroots, the planter class is leading the effort, and blacks are basically being mistreated and not given fair treatment and almost enslaved in being put on the levees to protect the levees and so forth. So the paternalistic Southern white planter class, the blacks felt that class had let them down. The planter class was not the Klansman population, but more paternalistic and so forth. But they did not save the blacks from mistreatment. And so that accentuated the great migration of blacks to the North. And some of the black leaders in the North, and remember, the blacks voted Republican still in the North, and they could vote in significant numbers in the North. The black leadership pressed Hoover, and they were, I think, disappointed with him, but he made efforts. Again, I cannot list them all in one quick answer here, but he gave the commencement speech, by the way, at Howard University in 1932. And this might interest your questioner. The black vote did not desert Hoover in 1932. It did in 36 when Roosevelt was running for re-election, but there was suspicion of Roosevelt, and the Democrats in Congress were basically led by the Southern hierarchs and so forth. So blacks had no reason in particular to think that the Democratic Party was going to be much of an alternative. So I looked into this, and although Hoover did not get the same level of support in 32 as he did in 28, the black majority stayed with him. So these are complicating factors. And again, I wish there were more time to say, but I think Hoover was well aware. And I think in his mind and heart, he felt that he was being well-meaning. One last point, if I may, Jerry, if time permits. Hoover was supported by the president of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a successor to Booker T. Washington. And Hoover's philosophy comported rather well with the kind of self-help, professionalized, educate yourself approach to betterment that the Tuskegee Institute epitomized. And this was controversial, or became controversial in the Black community, because some were more militant and thought that approach of Washington and Moton and others in that camp was not sufficient to break through the barriers of racial discrimination and oppression. So, but Hoover, I think, and said a number of things. If you look up his records, you can find them, speeches which were very encouraging of that. And he thought that blacks, by doing that, would build up a kind of a middle class and over time improve themselves. Now, this is not the same as dismantling the whole racial system, but it was ways in which I think you could say that for his time in the 20s and 30s, Hoover was a moderate progressive. And so his policy and record, therefore, I think needs to be examined quite carefully, because it's rather easy, I think, for us today to say, oh, well, that was just inadequate and so forth. You have to look at these things in context. And I think if you look at it in context, you'll find criticism, I'm sure, but also some things to praise in a more balanced understanding of what Hoover did and tried to do. So that would be, I hope, a beginnings of an adequate answer to a
very good.
Complicated question.
Well, very good, George. There are a lot of great questions. In fact, we have so many. I think we could probably do a weekly show with Q&A with you, Well, we may have to think of, well, we're gonna have to have you come back sooner, I think, on that, but
Well, I'd
just
be
like
happy to join you again sometime if that works out for you. Certainly, it's been a pleasure tonight.
that'd be great. So again, that's all the time we have for questions for now. And of course, I'd like to thank George Nash for joining us tonight for an excellent presentation. I'd also like to thank the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum, the Herbert Hoover National Historic Site, and all the public libraries that have helped make tonight's program a success. And of course, I'd encourage you all to come visit the Hoover campus and enjoy a walk around the park and explore the historic buildings as the temperatures are beginning to climb now and the flowers are starting to bloom here in West Branch. Now, for now, the Presidential Library remains closed to the public. The historic site is ready to welcome back visitors for the 2021 summer season, as all but one of the historic buildings are now, and the visitor center are now open. And of course, as a reminder, masks are required whenever you're inside a building here and outside if you're unable to maintain 6 foot of social distancing. And of course, once inside the park, you'll notice the many features of the park have been improved as a result of the stormwater mitigation project. And some of those features are really improved sight lines in and around Hoover Creek and a reconstructed Downey Street Bridge. And of course, please check with the park ranger when you for current closures as the stormwater project is winding down. Certain areas are open and sometimes they're closed for just a short time, others work there. And of course, the Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is ready to assist you with any of your membership or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus. And on behalf of all of us here at the Hoover campus and the participating public libraries, we thank you for joining us and look forward to your next visit to the Hoover campus. Have a great evening.